was just past midnight when Sarah's phone buzzed. The light from the screen illuminated her face in the dark bedroom, and she squinted at the number displayed. It was an unknown number, one she didn't recognize, but this didn't concern her immediately. She was used to the occasional spam call, the wrong numbers that people dialed when they were too tired to check the area codes. What made her hesitate was something else, the feeling that someone was watching her. Her pulse quickened and a chill ran down her spine as she glanced around the dark room. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, and for a moment she could have sworn she heard a creaking sound, as though the floorboards in the hallway had just shifted. She quickly dismissed the thought, chalking it up to her overactive imagination. After all, it was a quiet night. She had just finished a long week at work and was looking forward to a peaceful sleep. With a sigh, Sarah reached for the phone and swiped at the screen to answer the call. "Hello," she said, her voice slightly shaky, more out of caution than fear. At first, there was only silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that made her wonder if the call was a mistake. Perhaps it was just a malfunction. But then, slowly, she heard it, a faint sound, a soft breathing, as if someone was waiting just on the other side of the line. It was so subtle, so quiet, that it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. "Hello," she repeated, her voice growing more uncertain. Then the voice came. It was soft, melodic, and almost soothing, but there was something unsettling about it, a familiarity that she couldn't place, a tone that tugged at the edges of her memory. "Sarah," the voice said, dragging her name out in a way that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully." For a moment, Sarah's thoughts scrambled. How did the person on the other end of the line know her name? She hadn't said a word about herself, not even in her initial greeting. It was impossible for anyone to know her name without hearing it first. A sudden sense of dread filled her chest as she tried to gather her thoughts. Who is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. The voice didn't respond right away. It lingered in the air, stretching the seconds between her question and the answer. When it came, it was chilling. "Do you remember the old house on Willow Street? The one you used to live in when you were little?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't thought about that house in years. It was a place she tried to forget. The memories of the old house had always felt wrong. As a child, she had been terrified of it. The creaky floors, the strange noises that filled the night, and the way the shadows seemed to move on their own. But how could anyone possibly know that? How could they know about that place? She hadn't mentioned it to anyone in years. Her parents had long since sold the house, and she had moved away. "Who is this?" she demanded again, her voice shaky but firmer now, as a deep unease began to settle in her chest. But the voice on the other end didn't answer her question. Instead, it continued with eerie calmness, as though it had all the time in the world. "I remember the attic," it said, "the old rocking chair. You used to sit there and stare at the wall, not moving, not speaking, just waiting for something that never came. Do you remember, Sarah? Do you remember the feeling?" Her breath caught in her throat. She had almost forgotten about the attic, that small, dusty room in the top floor of the house, the place that always made her feel uneasy, the feeling of being watched, the sound of the chair rocking on its own. She had tried to block out those memories, bury them deep in her mind, but now they flooded back with vivid clarity. Her fingers tightened around the phone, and she swallowed hard, her throat dry. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "No, I don't. I don't remember. There was a brief pause, and for a moment, Sarah thought the line had gone dead. Then the voice spoke again, softer now, almost as though it was speaking directly into her ear. "You will, Sarah," the voice said. "You will remember everything. You will remember the night you left, the night you ran away." Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a cold sweat begin to form on her skin. She had never told anyone about the night she left that house, the night she ran away from the fear that had always haunted her there, the strange, unexplainable feeling that had filled the air, the whispers that seemed to echo through the walls, the dreams that tormented her after she moved away. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, her voice growing more desperate now. Stop calling me." But the voice was relentless. "You're not safe, Sarah. Not anymore," it said, its tone darkening. "The past has a way of catching up with us, and you've run long enough." Sarah's breath became shallow as panic started to rise in her chest. This was insane. This couldn't be happening. Who was this person? How did they know these things? She didn't want to hear anymore. She didn't want to think about the past, about that house, about the night she had left in a blind, terrified rush. But the voice wouldn't let her go. It continued, its words creeping under her skin, like a shadow moving across the floor. "Sarah, you're going to remember soon," the voice said. "You'll remember the truth, and then you'll understand." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Sarah was left staring at the screen, her pulse racing in her ears. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down on the bedside table, her mind racing. The silence in the room was deafening now, but it didn't feel comforting. It felt suffocating. She glanced at the time on the phone. 12:10 a.m. She'd only been asleep for an hour before the call woke her. She lay back in bed, trying to shake off the cold dread that had settled into her bones. She couldn't understand what had just happened. Could it have been some sort of prank? A voice distortion? Something? The details of the conversation replayed in her mind, but none of it made sense. How could the caller have known about the house, about her childhood, about the rocking chair in the attic? She hadn't spoken about any of it in years. No one had. Her mind raced through the possibilities, but none of them brought her any comfort. It was as though the call had unlocked something deep within her, something she had buried, something she didn't want to remember. With a sigh, Sarah reached for her phone again, debating whether or not to call the number back. But when she unlocked the screen, her heart stopped. The call had been logged under an unfamiliar contact name. It wasn't just a random number. It was a name she didn't recognize, but it chilled her to the core. She tapped on the contact and saw the message history. There was a single text sent several years ago. She couldn't make sense of the message. "It's coming for you." The message was from her own phone number. Her throat went dry as she stared at the screen. What was happening? The days following the phone call were a blur. Sarah tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than a strange, unsettling prank. After all, the voice had been so vague, so cryptic. It wasn't the first time she had received strange phone calls or bizarre messages. People did weird things. They found ways to break into lives they didn't belong to. The more she tried to reason with herself, the more she pushed it away. But it was harder than she expected. The feeling of being watched persisted. It followed her everywhere, like a shadow that lingered just out of sight. The corners of her vision felt heavier, as though something was there, waiting for her to turn and face it. The phone call hadn't been the only oddity. That night after the call ended, Sarah had gone back to bed, but sleep eluded her. She lay in the dark for hours, her mind racing through fragments of her childhood memories, of the house on Willow Street, of the rocking chair in the attic, of the strange, almost tangible fear she had felt there, the fear she had tried so hard to forget. She turned on her phone again to check for any other messages, but there was nothing. No trace of the mysterious caller, no new number, just silence. But her phone had a history, and it was in the history that she found the answer, or rather, the beginning of the answer. When she tapped through the message history, she saw a name. It was hers, but it was different somehow. It didn't look like the contact she had always used. It was a slightly altered version of her name, as though someone had typed it just slightly off. A few letters changed here and there. She looked at the message. "It's coming for you." That phrase burned in her mind as she tried to make sense of it. Who could have sent it? What could it mean? Was it a warning? Had someone from her past decided to come back and haunt her with old memories? She tried to dismiss the strange feeling of déjà vu as she stared at the text, but deep down, she knew it was connected to something far darker. The next morning, she tried to ignore the creeping feeling in the pit of her stomach. She went about her day, speaking with her co-workers, doing her usual errands. But every time she glanced at her phone, her heart would skip a beat. It had been silent since that night, but the silence was worse than the phone calls. It was as if something was holding its breath, waiting. Waiting for what? By the time the second call came, Sarah had convinced herself that it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone had found her phone number online. Maybe it was a spam call from some predatory telemarketer. But the moment she answered the phone, that familiar, eerie voice echoed in her ear. Sarah. Her blood ran cold. Her grip on the phone tightened, but she refused to hang up. She wanted to scream, to demand who was behind these calls. But the voice spoke again, and it seemed to pierce straight through her fear. "Do you know why I called you last night?" the voice asked, its tone growing soft, almost gentle. "Because the time is near. You can't outrun it anymore." Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Her body went rigid. It knew something. It knew something she didn't. And worse, it seemed to know what was coming. "The house on Willow Street," the voice continued, unbothered by her silence. "You never left it, Sarah. Not really. It's waiting for you. It's always waiting." Her mind was spinning. She could hardly comprehend what was happening. What did it mean that she never left the house? She had left. She had escaped when she was a teenager, running out of that place, running from whatever haunted it, whatever whispered from the shadows of that attic. But now, as she listened to the voice, a terrible thought began to form at the back of her mind. What if she hadn't escaped? What if whatever had been there was following her, waiting for her to return? "No," she whispered, almost to herself. "That's not true." But the voice continued, as if her denial had no weight. "Your past is always with you, Sarah. It never really leaves. It lingers. And in the end, it comes for you." The line went silent, but Sarah didn't dare to end the call. She sat frozen, holding the phone in her hand, too terrified to speak or move. Her entire body felt as though it were made of stone, and her mind raced with the fear of what the voice might say next. She felt as though time had frozen. The minutes stretched into hours. The silence between them seemed unbearable. The only sound in the room was her heartbeat pounding in her ears. And then, without any warning, the voice spoke again, and the words it spoke sent a cold shiver down her spine. "Sarah, you need to listen to me. The future isn't as far away as you think. It's already here. It's already happening." The voice paused, and Sarah could hear a faint sound on the other end, like a faint scratching, a scraping, as if something was moving in the background. It was soft, but it was unmistakable. A scraping sound like nails dragging across wood. The sound triggered something in Sarah's memory, something she had tried to forget. The sound of the rocking chair in the attic, creaking in the dead of night. The way the shadows had seemed to move on their own. The sound of something, someone, waiting for her in the dark. "No," she gasped, unable to speak further. Her voice faltered. "You will come back to it, Sarah," the voice said softly. "You will return, and when you do, you'll understand. You'll finally understand." The call ended abruptly, and Sarah was left staring at the screen, her mind reeling. She wanted to throw the phone across the room. She wanted to break free from the suffocating grip of the past that was slowly pulling her in. But she couldn't. She couldn't, because a deep, primal part of her knew something was coming. Something was drawing closer, and she couldn't stop it. The calls continued for days. Each one grew more disturbing, more cryptic, until Sarah could no longer ignore the growing sense of dread. The voice spoke of things she hadn't thought about in years. It told her things about her childhood, about her family, about the old house on Willow Street. It spoke of events she had buried deep in her mind, and the voice always told her the same thing. It's coming. Sarah tried everything to make it stop. She changed her phone number. She blocked the mysterious calls, but they kept coming. Every time she picked up the phone, the voice was there, waiting. By the third week, she began to question her own sanity. Was she going mad? Was this all just some horrible dream? But every time the phone rang, every time that voice echoed in her ear, it felt real. Too real to be a figment of her imagination. And then one evening, as Sarah sat alone in her apartment, the call came again. She was sitting on the couch, staring at the wall, trying to block out the noise in her head, when the phone rang. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced at the screen. Unknown number. It was too much. She couldn't take it anymore. "Hello," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause, the silence stretching for what felt like an eternity. Then the voice came, as cold and familiar as before. "Sarah, it's time." And suddenly, in that moment, everything clicked into place. She hadn't been running from the house. She had been running from herself. Her past had followed her, and now it had caught up with her. "You can't outrun what's coming, Sarah," the voice said, its tone dripping with inevitability. "You're not the person you think you are. You never were." Terror surged through Sarah, and her body went cold as realization dawned. The voice was hers. It was her own voice, but it wasn't her. It was the voice of someone who had already disappeared. The room felt suffocating. Sarah stood by the window, her eyes glazed, staring out into the night. The streetlights below flickered faintly, casting elongated shadows across the pavement. The world felt distant, as though she were no longer truly a part of it. Her hands trembled at her sides, the cold sweat on her skin a constant reminder of how far she had fallen into this nightmare. The voice had told her it was time. It was time for her to face what was coming. Time for her to confront the past she had tried so hard to escape. The darkness that had followed her, inching closer with every passing day, had finally caught up. It was no longer just a voice on the phone. It was a presence, something that had burrowed deep inside of her, rooting itself into her very soul. It had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Her phone, still in her hand, buzzed again. The screen lit up with the now familiar message, unknown number. She could feel her breath hitching, the instinctive dread curling deep within her chest. But this time, she wasn't afraid to answer. In fact, she was almost eager for it. She had to know. She had to understand what had been happening. With a shuddering breath, Sarah answered the call, her voice thick with resignation. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. The silence on the other end was brief, before the voice emerged, soothing, yet unnervingly familiar. "Sarah," it began, the name hanging in the air like a dark echo. "You're finally ready to listen." "I don't know what's happening anymore," she replied, her voice barely audible, trembling in the stillness of the room. "Why are you doing this to me? What do you want?" The voice didn't answer right away. Instead, there was a soft, almost imperceptible rustling sound, like the sound of pages turning in a book. "I don't want anything, Sarah," it said. "I'm just here to help you remember, to help you see the truth." The truth? Sarah's thoughts scrambled for some kind of clarity, some thread of logic to hold on to. She had searched for answers for so long, but now that they were within reach, she couldn't grasp them. It was like trying to catch smoke in her hands. You're not me, are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. The realization had started to settle in, a growing awareness that seemed to sink into her like a stone. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the voice responded, its tone colder now. "You've always known, Sarah," it said. "You've always known the truth, even if you didn't want to face it." The world around Sarah seemed to warp and distort. Her vision blurred, and she gripped the edge of the windowsill to steady herself. Something was changing. Something in the air was shifting. "You're not who you think you are," the voice continued. "The person you've become, the life you've built, it's all a lie. The real Sarah is still trapped, still waiting, and the moment has come, the moment to remember." The phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor, but she didn't care. The voice was everywhere now. It was inside her head, swirling around her like an all-encompassing fog. The walls seemed to close in, and she felt herself being pulled in all directions, as though she were both here and not here at the same time. Suddenly her vision sharpened, and in the reflection of the window she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her own reflection, no longer the face she had come to know as hers. The person staring back at her wasn't her. It was a stranger, someone whose eyes were filled with the same confusion and fear she had once felt, but whose expression was older, worn, as though the years had caught up with her. She reached out to touch the glass, but the reflection did not move with her. It remained still, its gaze locked onto hers, as if it were waiting for her to make the next move. Then, as if the universe had decided to reveal its hidden truths, the voice spoke one last time, its words cutting through the air like a blade. "Sarah, the house on Willow Street isn't just a house. It's a prison, a place where time and memory intertwine. You never escaped it. You only thought you did." In an instant, everything around her fell away. The world as she knew it seemed to dissolve into the dark, swirling void. The walls around her seemed to vanish, and the night itself seemed to stretch and warp like a terrible dream. For a brief moment, Sarah was weightless, suspended in nothingness, as if she were falling through an endless void. She could hear the voice again, but now it was distant, far off, as if it were coming from some other realm entirely. You've always been trapped, Sarah, and now you've come full circle. You've come back home. Then the world shifted again, and Sarah found herself standing in a place she knew all too well. The old house on Willow Street. But this time, it was different. The house was no longer the dilapidated, run-down building she remembered from her childhood. It was pristine, untouched by time, as though it had never aged at all. She stood in the middle of the living room, staring around her in disbelief. The walls were lined with old portraits, each one a face she thought she had forgotten. Her family, her childhood friends. There they were, staring at her with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her, eyes that knew her deepest secrets. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, but it wasn't the same. This time it felt comforting, familiar. And then she saw it, the rocking chair in the corner of the room, just as she remembered it from all those years ago. The chair that had always terrified her, the chair that had rocked on its own in the dead of night. But this time, it didn't rock. It was still, quiet, waiting. Sarah took a step forward, her feet moving of their own accord. She couldn't stop herself. She had to go toward it. She had to face it. As she approached the chair, the room seemed to shift again. The walls began to close in, the faces in the portraits now leering at her, their eyes filled with malice. She reached out to touch the chair, her fingers trembling, and as soon as she made contact with the wood, the world around her exploded in a flash of light. In that moment, Sarah understood. She had never left the house on Willow Street. She had never escaped the past. The rocking chair had been the anchor, the point in time where everything had started and everything would end. It was the key to understanding what had been haunting her all this time. And as she sat down in the chair, everything fell into place. The voice had been hers all along. The future had been speaking to her from the moment she had left the house as a child. And now, as she closed her eyes, she understood the truth. She had always been a part of this place, this endless cycle of time and memory. The rocking chair began to move. Slowly, gently, it rocked back and forth. And Sarah, now at peace, let herself drift into the darkness. As the chair rocked, the world around her began to fade away, slipping into nothingness. The house on Willow Street, the portraits, the memories, all of it dissolved into the void. And then, just before everything disappeared completely, the voice spoke one final time. "You've returned. Welcome home."